All right, welcome to week 5. You guys, we are past halfway. We are rolling now. This past weekend, I participated in a Tough Mudder, so that, hence the t-shirt. Some of us don't need excuses to play in the mud, but I'll never forget crossing that halfway point and feeling like it's all downhill from here. Folks, that's all down here from here. All downhill from here. We're going to do this. So today we're going to take a big jump forward. We've been looking at the medieval philosophers, Anselm and Aquinas, and today we're going to move into the modernist period. And so we're going to focus on a few names. Now, I've given you videos beneath this one to kind of help your studies. But remember, you're not being quizzed on those videos. You're being quizzed on the contents of your reading, and this video is intended to help with that. So today, we're going to talk about a man named René DeCartes. Now, René Descartes lived at the very end of the 16th century. He was born in 1596, and he lives until the middle of the 17th century. Now, René Descartes was a French philosopher, and he was known to be a staunch rationalist. A staunch rationalist. You see, he had no confidence in God's revelation. He had no confidence in the authority of the church. And so he placed all of his hope and all of his trust only on human reason, only on man's ability to think logically. According to René Descartes, he believed that the world's problems were pretty much all summed up in poor thinking. And so he felt that the most important thing he could do is help people think. Now, he believed that anything that could be doubted, should be doubted, can be doubted, and must be doubted. Which means that at some point you have to doubt all the way down to find what is undoubtable, what is solid, what is rock hard that you can rely on, and then you can build out of that. But anything that's not, any layer of sediment or soil on top of the rock, you have to dig beneath through doubting. And so what he wanted to argue then was that previously held assumptions, that previously held beliefs, things that we're taught that are commonly to be known to be true, we should doubt, and we should reach down to find the solid ground, which meant he doubted several aspects of life that had not been doubted. And so one of those would be just the notion of authority. He doubted authority. He doubted that I had any validity whatsoever as the professor, which meant he would have gotten a negative grade. But this is what makes him such a hero down the line for the French Revolution. He doubts authority. He doubts the ability or the justification of authority to hold power. He also doubts our senses. He argues that our senses aren't reliable, that sometimes we think we feel something, we think we smell something, we think we hear something, but sometimes that's a dream. Sometimes we don't feel the warmth of the fire. We think we do, but we're actually dreaming in our cold bed. And so that's what led him to kind of get to his summation of his thought, the phrase with which we generally understand him, which is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. At the base level of all things, according to Descartes, was a thinking being. Which again, makes sense. If he thinks that all the problems are caused by poor thinking, then it makes sense for him to think that we are thinking beings primarily. His whole point was that non-existent things don't ever ponder their own existence. So I'll be slow on that so we can think about that. His belief was that things that don't exist never stop to consider whether or not they exist. So the fact that he considers his own existence, for him, attests to the truth of his existence. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. But he also goes further than that. And so what else he argues is that he can think of things greater than himself. He can consider things that are greater than himself, but that's greater than he could be or greater than he is, and therefore those thoughts had to have been placed there by something, and that something, that perfect thing, is God. Therefore, God exists. It's a unique argument, but it's an interesting one. It's an interesting philosophical argument for the existence of God. And so Descartes was a rationalist. He placed all of his confidence on human logic, on reason, on rationality. The next person I want to talk to you about is Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was born a little bit later than Descartes, but he was born in 1623 and he dies in the middle of the 17th century. His famous work that we know, that we study, is called his Pensées, which is his defense of Christian belief. Now, in order to understand Pascal, you have to understand his personality. He was a French philosopher, but he was always a bit of an outcast, a bit of a pessimist, and kind of makes sense. He was a hunchback. He never really fit into society as a whole. He kind of existed on his own. And so because of his outlook on life, because he was primarily pessimistic, one of the things that he did in the Pensées was to kind of describe life in as negative a consequence as you can imagine. And so he wouldn't simply try and persuade you that life wasn't hard, or that suffering didn't exist, or that you could buck up and stand it. Instead, he would emphasize how much life stunk, how hard life was. And his goal was to get through the bad news to get to the good news, that this life is temporary, that this life is fading, that according to Scripture, that this life is a mist that vanishes like the morning, but that there is hope for something greater in eternality, in eternity. And so he's famous for what's known as Pascal's wager. Now, Pascal's wager goes, it's pretty simple. Pascal's wager says that everyone dies. There's 100% chance everyone dies. Now, if everyone dies and Christianity is true, then Christians gain everything at death, but non-Christians lose everything at death. But then he turned it on its head and said, but if Christianity is false, then neither Christians nor non-Christians gain anything at death. And so it was at the very least worthwhile for non-believers to consider the possibility that Christianity be true, because they literally have nothing to lose and everything to gain. He's got a point. Now let's run through 3 quick political thinkers that I'm putting in your PowerPoint, that I'm putting in your notes, that I want you to kind of have an idea of, okay? The first is a man named Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived during the time of the English Civil Wars. Now, if you don't know that history, it's okay. Just imagine if someone were alive during the American Civil War, how that would affect and shape the way they understood things, especially how that would affect and shape the way they understood government. So Hobbes, is important to understand his context in order to understand his thought. The big thing that I want you to know is that Hobbes believed that before government existed, man existed in a state of war. That humanity was chaotic, was fighting, was savage, and that the existence of government brings peace and brings order out of the chaos. And so in his book Leviathan, what he's arguing for, he's making an argument to submit to government for the sake of peace, even if it's bad government. Now, that is a little bit different thought than our second thinker. That's John Locke. John Locke was also an English philosopher, also lived during the time of the English Civil Wars, and he was an early advocate of what we would call the freedom of belief or freedom of religion. His whole point was that religion is a personal thing, and that the government or the state has no business governing people's thoughts, governing people's beliefs. Instead, the government should simply restrict itself to civil matters. And so he was very influential in the foundation of the American democracy and the American endeavor. And so you see his thoughts come directly through the first two amendments of to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The freedom of religion, that the state shall establish no religion, official state religion, and shall not interrupt the free exercise thereof. That is very Lockean thought. And then you also have the second, which is the right to bear arms. In order to stand against a tyrannical government, in order to preserve our rights, we may have to defend our rights, and therefore the government has no business disarming the populace. However you feel about gun control, which is a hot topic, but however you feel about gun control, that doesn't rearrange or rewrite the Second Amendment and what it was originally intended to exist as. According to Locke, who is being read and highly influential in Thomas Jefferson, highly influential in the early colonial Congress. According to him, that's why it's there. It's to defend ourselves against government overreach. Now, for Locke, man before government existed in a state of peace. That man existed in a state of peace and was willing to give up a small amount of small freedoms in order to retain their rights in public society. Now that differs then from our third political thinker, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that before the government, man existed in a state of nature. And the state of nature was kind, it was peaceful, it was serene. It's kind of like this gorgeous day, I'm outside. And that society, bumping into one another in it and interacting, that's what brought the problems that face mankind. He was an 18th century philosopher, so he's a little bit down the road from these previous two. He was born in Geneva but studied in Paris, France. And so his argument was that people are innately, genuinely, originally good, but they've been ruined by society. So society isn't the panacea that heals the wounds of humanity. It is instead the plight upon humanity. And the reason why he seems to think this is he's enamored by the stories coming out of the American colonies. He's fascinated with the stories of the Native American, the Native American Indians at the time. Why? Because they seem to have been what he called noble savages. They lived peacefully, harmoniously. Yeah, they weren't as advanced as the colonial society, but they were peaceful, they were happy, they weren't hostile. But the more the colonialists encroached upon their space and introduced them to civilization, they became addicted and in search of alcohol and vice, and their morality structure decayed. And so society, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was a detriment to the Native Indians, the Native Americans. It wasn't the healing salve that it was made out to be. What do you need to do this week? You need to read your textbook. Remember that you're reading to understand. You're not reading to check the box that you've done it. You're reading to understand. Read your text. Watch this video. Congratulations, you've done that. Good job. So watch this video. Remember, you're not being quizzed on these other videos below. I've put these videos down here to give you something else to help you understand. That's all it's intended to be, is a study aid. You're not being quizzed or graded or tested on the content in these videos. These videos are just supplemental. So, do your reading. You're watching this video. Download your PowerPoint, study your PowerPoint, know your PowerPoint. Then, when you feel comfortable, take your quiz. And don't forget, your paper this week is a comparison and contrast between Christianity and Islam. It should be an interesting paper. It should be interesting. I'm looking forward to reading. Have a great week. I'll see you next week.